Marjorie Merriweather Post gave 65 years to her family's legacy, her youth to her father's business, and her middle age to the preservation of 4 marriages. She inherited control of the Postum Company and lived a life that popular narratives describe as one of shielded luxury and impeccable social standing. Conventional accounts suggest her immense wealth and philanthropy acted as a fortress against the vulnerabilities of the world. She died at 86, surrounded by dozens of staff members in a grand residence, yet family correspondence reveals she was often profoundly alone. Her memorial services were attended primarily by those she had paid, a quiet testament to a life spent giving that failed to secure reciprocal protection. Official biographies celebrate her as a fortunate heiress devoted to culture and diplomacy. Estate documentation from 1938 tells a different story of structural extraction. These records confirm that during her marriage to Joseph E. Davies, Marjorie personally funded their opulent lifestyle, while her husband received the official credit for diplomatic successes. She gave $20 million in personal expenditures to support his career, a quantified metric of labor that offered no legal or emotional safeguard. Financial ledgers itemize her continuous gifting to 47 family members whom she supported for over 3 decades. Even with infinite advantages, her devotion did not prevent betrayal, abandonment, or the social invisibility that followed her final divorce. The system that governed Marjorie's life was meticulously engineered to extract female labor under the guise of social propriety. From childhood, daughters of the American elite were positioned as assets for family advancement rather than individuals with autonomy. Mothers trained girls rigorously in deportment, language, and etiquette to prepare them for dynastic goals. Private letters housed at Hillwood Estate show Marjorie's lessons in diplomacy and charm began at age 7. By her 20s, she was orchestrating 1,000 guest events annually, acting as a tireless steward of her family's public image. Every hour of her social season was devoted to a labor economy that promised protection but delivered only obligation. This pattern of systematic exploitation repeats across the archives of the Gilded Age dynasties. Marriage markets functioned as intense labor economies where daughters were presented as viable commodities. Contemporary society pages reported that a young woman's prospects were mathematically calculated based on social positioning. Caroline Astor coordinated a network of 10 leading matrons who used a ballroom capacity of exactly 400 to enforce gatekeeping. If one matron excluded a daughter, all followed automatically, as revealed in letters from the 1880s unsealed in 1995. These coordinated alliances ensured that a daughter's social survival depended entirely on her willingness to give her autonomy to the system. The intellectual mechanics of this extraction were codified in standardized marriage contracts. Financial ledgers and trust documents from 1890 to 1920 confirm that daughters were rarely consulted in these negotiations. The same 3 law firms designed contracts for 12 prominent families using identical templates. These terms specified immediate cash transfers, annual income stipends, and property allocations while treating human desires as irrelevant. Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage was negotiated for a $2.5 million payment and significant property transfers. Her diary, sealed for 50 years, documents suicide attempts and the misery of a 20-year loveless marriage. Mothers across these dynasties employed identical mechanisms to commodify their daughters' giving labor. Letters between Alva Vanderbilt and Consuelo reveal calculated manipulation and emotional coercion. Alva explicitly wrote that her daughter's feelings were irrelevant to the marriage that would save the family's position. Biographical files maintained by Hillwood Museum indicate this labor was expected, unpaid, and unrecognized. Archival evidence proves that maternal exploitation was not an isolated tragedy, but a structural requirement of dynastic preservation. Mothers shared strategies to ensure favoured daughters succeeded while marginalising others who did not fit the market's needs. Sister hierarchies reinforced this inequity through the differential allocation of resources. Estate documentation from the 1920s establishes that beautiful daughters often received $2 million dowries. By contrast, sisters perceived as plain or less useful to the dynasty were assigned as little as $50,000. One private letter housed at the Library of Congress specifies that Marjorie's sister Margaret was required to learn charm lessons thrice weekly. These discrepancies reinforced lifelong inequalities despite each sister performing emotional labour at equal intensity for family benefit. The archives prove that giving more than what was required could not overcome a structural bias toward the already advantaged. The physical architecture of elite life served as a venue for this invisible labour. Ballrooms, dining halls, and guest chambers were instruments for social power and the display of maternal preparation. Marjorie's residence at Spaso House in Moscow required her to manage 1,200 diplomatic guests annually. She personally orchestrated floral arrangements and the rotation of Imperial Russian porcelain for hundreds of events. Estate inventories record over 500 pieces handled with precision, reflecting decades of uncredited collection management. She devoted 12 hours daily to event logistics and staff oversight, while embassy records confirm the government funded only formal salaries. Trust documents dated 1923 prove that Marjorie's father, C.W. Post, viewed his daughter as a biological extension of his corporate empire rather than a beneficiary of his love. While he left her control of the company, the internal correspondence shows he expected her to sacrifice her personal identity to maintain the brand's moral image. She became the Lady Bountiful of the Postum Company, a role that required her to personally respond to thousands of letters from struggling families during the Depression. This was not mere charity, it was unpaid corporate branding. For 30 years, she managed this public-facing labour, while her husbands and male advisors made the strategic decisions that increased the family fortune. Probate proceedings from 1955 detail the brutal reality of how the system treated this devotion once the labour was no longer profitable. Following her divorce from Joseph Davies, Marjorie found that the social circles she had cultivated for decades, the 1,000 guests she hosted every year, vanished almost overnight. Her letters from this period, preserved in the Hillwood archives, describe a house that had become a hollow monument. Despite giving millions to the State Department and the arts, she was excluded from the very circles she had built. The system had extracted her youth, her beauty, and $20 million of her personal fortune, only to discard her when she no longer served a man's career. Marriage negotiations for Marjorie's second marriage illustrate the cold market pricing of the era. Property transfer records establish that the merger between the Post and Hutton fortunes was treated with the same clinical precision as a railroad acquisition. There were no clauses for emotional support or domestic safety. Instead, the contracts itemized the maintenance of 5 residences and the staff of 43 required to run them. Marjorie was effectively the CEO of a domestic corporation, working 16-hour days to ensure the social machinery functioned perfectly. Financial ledgers from E.F. Hutton's accounts show that while he benefited from the social prestige Marjorie provided, she remained the sole financier of their private lives. This systemic exploitation was not limited to the United States. Contemporary society pages from London and Paris reported on the dollar princesses. Wealthy American girls traded for European titles. Museum acquisition records from the Met indicate that many of the great art collections were built on the backs of these women's dowries. While the husbands were credited with saving ancestral estates, it was the wives' labour and capital that did the work. Financial records from the Marlborough estate prove that Consuelo Vanderbilt's dowry rebuilt Blenheim Palace, yet she was treated as an unwanted intruder in her own home. The archives document a global pattern. Women's giving was the fuel that ran the dynastic engine, but they were never allowed in the driver's seat. Biographical files maintained by various historical societies show that even when these women rebelled, they did so within the constraints of the caregiver archetype. Marjorie began collecting Russian imperial art not as a hobby, but as a way to preserve a culture she felt was being abandoned. She spent decades curating, cataloguing, and protecting pieces that the Soviet government was willing to discard. In doing so, she was caregiving for history itself. Her letters to curators reveal an obsession with detail, ensuring every piece was housed in a way that felt like a home. Even in her intellectual pursuits, she could not escape the role of the nurturer, giving her life to objects because the people in her life had failed to reciprocate her care. Tax filings from the 1960s demonstrate the sheer scale of her continued generosity even in her twilight years. She maintained a staff of dozens, not out of vanity, but because she felt responsible for their families' livelihoods. Many of her employees had been with her for 40 years. She paid for their children's educations and their medical bills, a documented pattern of caregiving that exceeded any social or legal requirement. Yet, institutional records from the organisations she founded show that her name was often omitted from the boards of directors. She was the founder in spirit, but men held the authority in practice. The isolation of these women was often engineered by the very families they supported. Wills and codicils from the era specify that if a woman remarried or sought independence, her trust income could be revoked. This was financial domestic abuse codified into law. Records show that Alice Astor faced similar restrictions. Her life was a series of negotiations for her own money. Marjorie, too, had to navigate a complex web of trustees and advisors to access the fortune she had inherited. The system was designed to keep her in a state of perpetual giving while ensuring she never had the power to stop. Female-to-female betrayal was a necessary survival mechanism within this system. Contemporary accounts of the 400 in New York describe a landscape where women had to tear each other down to protect their own daughters' positions. One diary from a contemporary of Marjorie's describes the social season as a civil war in silk. The archives show that mothers would deliberately spread rumours about a rival's daughter to lower her market value. This was not catty behaviour. It was a desperate response to a system that only had room at the top for a few. Marjorie herself was often the target of these campaigns, documented in the biting columns of society rags that she kept in her scrapbooks. The death certificates of the Gilded Age heiresses often list natural causes, but their private letters suggest a different kind of expiration, the exhaustion of a lifetime of unrewarded giving. Marjorie's final years, documented in medical records and staff reports, reveal a woman who was still trying to host even when she could no longer walk. She insisted on the full protocol of a 40-person dinner even when she was the only one at the table. She was trapped in the performance of the caregiver, unable to stop giving because she had no other identity. The archives show that her sense of self had been entirely consumed by the institution she built. Pattern recognition across these families proves that the official narrative was a carefully constructed mask. Histories of the Rockefeller family praise Abby Aldrich Rockefeller for her role in founding MoMA, but her personal correspondence reveals she had to beg her husband for every dollar of the museum's budget. She gave her health and her social capital to the project, only for it to be remembered as a male triumph. The archives of the 19th and 20th centuries are filled with the ghosts of women who were the supportive wives of history, while the documents prove they were the primary architects of the legacy. Marjorie's resilience through loss was documented in her response to the many deaths and divorces that punctuated her life. After each tragedy, she did not retreat. She gave her way through it. She built hospitals, supported the Red Cross, and turned her homes into centres of cultural diplomacy. Financial ledgers itemize millions in donations during the war years. She was a woman who believed that if she just gave enough, she would finally be safe. But the archives prove the safety never came. Her third husband, Joseph Davies, cheated on her and used her money to fund his infidelities, a fact documented in the private investigative reports she was forced to commission. The systematic erasure of female contribution is nowhere more evident than in the business records of the companies these women inherited. Official histories of General Foods rarely mention Marjorie's role in the strategic acquisition of Birdseye frozen foods, the move that revolutionized the industry. Internal memos, however, show it was her vision and her insistence that led to the deal. She was the one who saw the potential for a woman's life to be made easier by technology. She was caregiving for the American housewife from her boardroom, yet she was denied a seat at the table when the final decisions were made. The archives of the 1970s, as Marjorie approached the end of her life, show a woman who had become a living relic. She was celebrated as a grande dame, but the private records show she was a woman whose giving had left her bankrupt of genuine connection. The system had taken everything she had to offer and left her with a museum, a beautiful, cold monument to a life spent in service to others. Her estate records from 1973 show that while she left millions to Hillwood, the personal bequests to individuals were surprisingly small, reflecting the lack of deep, reciprocal relationships in her final years. If you have given decades to family legacy, to parents who consumed your identity, or to a partner who took your labour for granted, Marjorie's documented life proves the pattern was never about your inadequacy. You were told that if you raised the children, nursed the parents, and sacrificed your career, you would be protected. But the archives of the most powerful women in history show that the system lied. Marjorie Merriweather Post had every advantage the world could offer: beauty, $200 million, and a work ethic that never quit. She gave 65 years of perfect service to the people around her, and the system still failed to protect her. Your decades of caregiving were real and valuable, even if they were never properly credited. The fact that you were left feeling invisible or economically vulnerable isn't because you didn't give enough. It's because the system was designed to extract that giving from you until there was nothing left. Marjorie's financial records and private letters prove that the promise of reciprocity was a structural illusion. If 20 million and 65 years of perfect performance couldn't guarantee safety for her, then your failure to find safety wasn't your fault. Understanding this history is the first step toward reclaiming your identity. You were not a failure as a caregiver, you were a successful victim of a predatory system. Marjorie's archives rescue her from the myth of the happy heiress and reveal her as a woman who worked tirelessly for a world that never truly saw her. By recognizing the pattern in her life, you can validate the truth of your own. Your sacrifices mattered, but the system that accepted them was never intended to reward you. The documentary evidence is clear. Women have been the invisible engines of dynasty and culture for centuries, and their reward has consistently been erasure. Marjorie's 47 family members, her 1,000 guests, and her 4 husbands all took what she had to give. When you look at your own life and see the decades of unrewarded labour, know that you are part of a long line of women who were designed to be consumed. You were right to doubt the official story. You were right to feel that the give and be protected promise was a lie. The archives prove it. As we look at the legacy of women like Marjorie Merriweather Post, we see that their true resilience wasn't just in their giving, but in their survival of the extraction. They continued to build, to create, and to care, even when the world offered them nothing in return. This is the ultimate validation for the caregiver sage. Your giving was a heroic act in a system that didn't deserve it. The documentary proof of their lives honours your survival. You were never inadequate. You were simply following a script that was written to benefit everyone but you. Marjorie Merriweather Post gave 65 years, managing her father's correspondence, curating his collection and protecting his reputation long after his 1919 death. She inherited $38 million. She never married for her own happiness, never had a career that was truly her own, and never built a life centered on her own desires. She died at 96, surrounded by paid staff, but no family who could truly see the woman behind the fortune. If you've given decades to family legacy, to parents who consumed your identity, to work that left you invisible, Marjorie's documented life proves the pattern was never about inadequate giving. She had hundreds of millions of dollars. She performed perfectly. She followed every rule of the perfect woman. The system still extracted everything and left her isolated. Your decades of caregiving were real. Your sacrifices mattered. The fact they weren't reciprocated doesn't mean you failed. It means the system was designed to extract without protecting. Marjorie's estate records prove it. If all her wealth and all her years couldn't guarantee reciprocal care, the failure was structural, not personal. You were never supposed to be protected. You were designed to be consumed. But in knowing this, you are finally free from the burden of your own perceived inadequacy. The archives have set the record straight.